So what is up, guys? Nick here, helping you to master your technology. This is the best iPhone you can buy in 2023. Take a guess before I flip it over. You can probably tell by the notch. It's the iPhone 13 Pro Max. Now, I was spending a lot of time over the past couple days thinking about which is the best, and yes, the 13 Pro, if you want to go a little bit smaller, can count as well. But overall, for the best deal, I do think that if you're looking for this third party right now, this is going to be the best deal of 2023. And that includes even when the 14 or the 15s come out, because I don't think the 14 Pro Max is going to drop quite as fast. You can see right here on this phone right here, you could see the iPhone 13 Pro Maxes can be had at around $800 or so. Now, to put that in perspective, this phone right here does give you, pretty much everything that you're going to get with an iPhone 14 Pro Max. But I want to talk about why this is a really good deal right now. It's really the best balance of high-end features, a phone that feels top-notch at a price that you can get an iPhone 14 and 14 Plus for. So we've talked about that before. Why would you get that when you can get the iPhone 13 Pro Max? But it retains as the best value because, they didn't really do enough, I think, with the 14 Pro and Pro Max to really take the iPhone to the next level. Yes, they changed Dynamic Island, and I do really like it, and you do get used to it. But it's not something that really has changed my opinion on the iPhone. Like if I go back to, using this particular iPhone with this notch right here, it's not gonna decrease my everyday iPhone experience, so keep that in mind. Now, this price point can be had, when you first bought this phone, it was $1,200, $1,400, depending on the storage, depending on your country, it could have been even more. Now you're getting like a $400 discount on this phone, and it's literally got the same stainless steel edges here on the body. This is the graphite colorway. It's a little bit hard to get that into focus, but yeah, it's smudgy a little bit, but it still feels like $1 million in your hand. It still has these large cameras on the rear, triple camera setup. It still has the nice matte material back here on this graphite. Just feels very nice and premium, just like if you bought a 14 Pro Max. So saving several $100s is kind of like when you go get a car, you can buy last year's model and save $3,000-$4,000. You can do the same here, but in the $100 ranges. There are smartphones here. You could save depending on the condition, you might even save $500 or $600 if you're willing to deal with a couple scratches on the phone. Now, the phone itself, body and design wise, also not really a big deal. I mean, the iPhone 14 Pro and the iPhone 14 Pro Max look identical to this phone. So here is an iPhone 14 Pro. When you hold the thing, it feels like the same phone as a 13 Pro Max. So yeah, it's got a little bit bigger cameras, a little bit more features, but at the end of the day, the iPhone 13 Pro Max still feels like I'm paying around the same money for that phone, but actually a 14 Pro costs more than an iPhone 13 Pro Max. So keep that in mind. You can get the max battery life, the max size for cheaper than the smaller iPhone 14 Pro. That's quite the deal. Next up is the display on this phone. So we've raved about the iPhone 14 Pro Max's display getting super bright. Well, this one also hits a ridiculous brightness level of 1000 nits. Now, I have appreciated the extra brightness on the 14 Pro and Pro Max outdoors, but these phones already got super bright. They weren't hard to see outdoors either. And honestly, I've talked about this before, but I actually reduced the white point every single night on my 14 Pro Max. Once it starts getting a little dark, it's just too bright. Yes, it's really nice outdoors, but at home, it's simply too bright. So there's no issue with still using a 13 Pro Max, as it's not quite as bright as newer phones. And I'm not trying to lead you on to believe that I think Apple should start making really low brightness phones. That's not my point here. My point is that if you're buying this phone, you're not really sacrificing too much just because you didn't get the 2000 nits that come with the 14 Pro and Pro Max. Now, in terms of software, we do still get software updates on here, just like you'll get with the newer phones. And it's still going to have updates for several years, maybe 5 years actually, because Apple decided to keep the A15 Bionic on the newer 14. So this should get just as long of updates as the 14 and 14 Plus models. You know, if Apple's being kind to you guys, you can see right here, 6 gigabytes of RAM. I don't see why they would give you less updates when you have the same chipset over a 14 and 14 Plus. 6 gigs of RAM. So nothing ever stutters, nothing's ever slow. We already know iPhones have reached the pinnacle of performance already, that Apple needs to start doing other things besides just focusing on making them faster, because it ain't really changing our day-to-day life, especially on a mobile platform. We aren't playing, you know, AAA titles like we play on, you know, like a gaming computer. I mean, yeah, there are games on here, and the gaming performance I would always like to see improved. But at the same time, you know, most iPhone users are just using this thing day to day. And at this point, talking about speed and performance, if you notice, I've cut back a lot on my speed tests because they're just so fast. It doesn't really matter as much these days. So yeah, if you buy this phone now, buttery smooth. And also consider that you're getting this phone cheaper again than the 14 Pro, and also getting a ProMotion display. It just makes it the best deal right now. You're getting ProMotion and cheaper than a newer 14 Pro, the smaller model. Now, if you want to save even more, you go to the 13 Pro and you also get ProMotion. So really, display is really good for the money here on this one. Now, I will say that you can get better displays, I think, on Samsung phone. Like if you're buying a used Ultra model or something like that, it is a little bit more punchy. But if you like that natural color, and you don't have to deal with the notch in those phones, but if you like the natural color, the smoothest kind of scrolling feel, I think it's still going to be on this 13 Pro Max and the 14 Pro Max. So really strong right there. Now, the next area I want to go into just a little bit is the camera. Now, I actually kind of missed something about the iPhone 13 Pro Max. So with the newer 14 Pro Max, when you take photos, because they've increased the megapixels, it also kind of increases the bokeh in the background. It's like a little bit more blur action, but that also reduced the focus a little bit. So I still think the 13 Pro Max is the better consumer camera for people who just want to point and shoot. But I think if you're willing to dial in, I do think the iPhone 14 Pro Max is the better option. However, I don't like how Apple's doing a lot of post-processing on these current iPhones, especially the 14 Pros, over sharpening after taking that photo. I mean, it is cool. It does look tack sharp, but sometimes I find like they're making it too sharp. So I actually think for some people, they're going to really like the 13 Pro Max results more. And if you see, I mean, come on, guys. The results on here, they're standing toe-to-toe, even with some point and shoots. Now, this camera here, this is Sony ZV-1 I'm shooting this current video on. You know, this camera definitely does a little bit better than a phone. It's a 1-inch sensor. But when you start tuning in with these phones, you get something like a manual camera application, and you start changing your own exposure values, white balances, ISO, and you hold those things there. You know, you hold them there so the white balance is not flickering all over the place. I mean, you can get some pro level stuff on these phones. Also, when you go to photo down here, you have 16:9. So if you want to take your thumbnails for YouTube, you want to do your square for Instagram, you got different photographic styles if you don't really want to dive too much into the photography world, but you just want a vibrant photo, throw it in vibrant. I mean, it's really simple and it really gets great results. Cinematic video was introduced here, and yes, there's no action mode, but I would wager to bet that most people are not going to be using a Pro Max iPhone for doing GoPro like activities. They would probably get a GoPro for something like that, because you're going to strap this thing to your head, you know, when you're doing some action stuff. I don't think so. So that's not really a reason to say don't get this. Portrait modes got better on the newer phones, and they're not the best here, but they still work pretty well. And again, this was, I think, the model that launched a macro photography mode. So really, you can get super, super close on items there. Like, I mean, you can see the dust, the dirt on the back of that camera. That's how much detail here. So we had to dive deep into the camera. Also, again, saving several $100s, in a couple $100s over 14 Pro, you're going to get better battery life, bigger battery on here, and better than the smaller, newer phone. I will say, if you want the ultimate battery life, sacrifice the 120 hertz and get the 14 Plus. That thing is a monster in battery, but you have to deal with a more laggy 60 hertz, which you can kind of feel it out here if you throw it in low power mode as this tweaks down to 60 hertz. There's also a setting in iPhone where you can actually run it in 60 hertz all the time if you want, but most people buying a ProMotion are not ever going to do that. So I'll quickly just brush on the, the Face ID connectivity. We have 5G here. Face ID feels just as fast as ever. And honestly,